Ruth stepped into the widow's cabin, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of tobacco and dust. It had become familiar over the months, almost like a second skin. The silence settled in around her, thick and suffocating, but Ruth had learned to ignore it. She had cleaned this cabin every week for as long as she could remember, each sweep of her rag another familiar movement in a long, unspoken ritual. Her hands were rough from the work, calloused from scrubbing the floors and wiping down the surfaces. This was the life she had built, a life rooted in repetition, in things that didn't change. She moved slowly, the rag slipping across the counter, each stroke deliberate, as if the act of cleaning could somehow erase the weight of the room itself. The widow had been gone for months now, but something about this place still held onto her. Ruth had always felt it, the presence of the widow, hanging in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. The house groaned again, the floorboards protesting under her weight. The silence between the creaks seemed to thicken, pressing in on her chest. Ruth paused, listening to the stillness. It wasn't the sound of a house settling. There was something else there, something deeper, like the echo of memories long forgotten. Ruth shifted her gaze toward the chair by the hearth. It was old, beaten by time, sitting unused for months. But tonight, it felt different, like it was waiting. Watching her. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. There were no ghosts in this house. Not really. The widow had passed on, and the house should have followed her. But the longer Ruth stayed here, the more she wondered. The sound of the floorboards creaking again made her stop. She stiffened. It wasn't the settling of the house this time. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Ruth turned quickly, scanning the room, her breath shallow in her throat. The chair by the hearth was still. The dust on the shelves remained undisturbed. Yet something felt off. A rustling came from the hallway, soft, like the shuffle of feet. Ruth's stomach turned. She'd been coming here for months, and she had never felt anything like this. There was no one else here. She knew that. The widow's house was abandoned. Yet the sound seemed to come from somewhere close, from the very walls themselves. Then, a loud bang from upstairs shook the stillness, cutting through the tension like a knife. Ruth froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The noise echoed down the narrow hall, distant but sharp. She stared at the ceiling, where shadows danced against the walls. Another creak. Another shuffling sound. Ruth's pulse quickened. Someone or something was upstairs. Her mind raced. She hadn't heard anyone enter. There was no one else in the house, was there? She checked the doors, locked them all. But still, the noise continued, muffled by the old wood. Ruth could feel her body tense, muscles wound tight, her instinct to run warring with the need to know what was happening. What was up there? She took a slow step toward the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. Ruth's eyes lingered on the stairs, the darkened path leading to the second floor. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to turn and run, to leave the house and never look back. But the other part, the part that couldn't ignore what was happening, urged her forward. There was something she had to see, something she had to understand. The creak from above grew louder, followed by another bang. Ruth's legs moved on their own. She didn't even remember deciding to climb the stairs, but there she was, hand gripping the railing, her feet moving in the dim light. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air colder, as though the very house was resisting her presence. As she reached the top, the hallway stretched before her, narrow and dark. The door to the widow's room was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it swallowing the faint light from the staircase. Ruth couldn't see anything. The house was silent now, the sound of shuffling gone, replaced by the weight of the air itself pressing down on her. She stood at the threshold of the door, her breath shaky, heart hammering in her chest. The cabin felt too still, too empty. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in the corners of her vision, pulling her toward the room. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing behind her, only the long stretch of the hallway, the air heavy with the echoes of the past. Without thinking, Ruth pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the widow's room. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The room had always been dark, cluttered with the widow's belongings, but now it was worse. The air felt thick with memories, with things left unsaid, with stories never told. It wasn't just the room that was cold, it was the whole house. Ruth's eyes scanned the room, stopping at the old portrait hanging above the bed. The widow's face was sharp, eyes glaring down at her, as if accusing her of something. Ruth shivered, her gaze moving to the dust-covered furniture. The bed, the small dresser, the table in the corner, they hadn't been touched in months. The room was frozen in time, like it was waiting for something to happen. Or someone. The floor creaked again, behind her, but Ruth didn't turn. Instead, she stared at the bed, and then at the small wooden box half buried under the bed's edge. Her pulse quickened. What was it? What was in the box? Ruth crouched down, her fingers brushing the cold wood. The box was small, plain, and weathered by time. She pulled it from its hiding place, the noise of the wood scraping against the floor sending a shiver up her spine. As she opened the lid, a rush of cold air swept through the room, making her skin crawl. Inside, there were papers, old letters, yellowed by age, and a photograph that had blurred with time. Ruth picked up one of the letters, her fingers trembling. She unfolded it slowly, as though she feared what it might say. The writing was tight, hurried. A plea for help. And at the bottom, written in familiar ink, was a name, Emery. Ruth's heart stopped. Emery. Her father's name. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to face it. But there it was, staring back at her. Her father. The man who had abandoned her. The man who had left without a trace, without a word. And now, the widow had written to him. The room grew colder, the silence pressing in harder. Ruth stood up quickly, the letter falling from her hands. She felt dizzy, as though the walls were closing in around her. And then, a soft whisper brushed against her ear. Ruth froze. Help me. Ruth hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, the weight of the house pressing down on her chest. The hallway above was swallowed by shadows, only the faintest sliver of light spilling from the cracked door of the widow's room. Her feet didn't move at first. She stood still, listening to the silence, letting it stretch into something suffocating. The cabin was breathing, creaking with a low hum. Her mind screamed at her to turn around. Go back. Leave this place. But her body moved on its own, one step, then another, until she reached the foot of the stairs. The old wood groaned beneath her weight. Each creak was like a warning, like the house was whispering its disapproval. She gripped the banister, her fingers tight around the rough wood. There was no turning back now. Her breath shallow, she took the first step. The air was colder here, thicker, pressing against her skin. She climbed slowly, trying not to make a sound. The only noise was her heartbeat pounding in her ears. At the top, the hallway stretched long and narrow, disappearing into the darkness. The widow's room was at the end. Ruth's eyes drifted toward the door, and she saw it, the faint flicker of light spilling from the gap. The door was barely open, like it was waiting for her, calling her in. Her legs felt heavy, but she couldn't stop herself. She moved toward it, each step slower than the last, like something unseen was tugging her in. The creak of the floorboards beneath her feet was deafening, but she couldn't stop, couldn't leave. The door was half open. Ruth reached for the knob, hesitated, and then pushed it open. The room felt colder than before, as though the walls themselves had frozen in time. The air was thick, weighed down with dust and memories. Ruth stepped in, her boots scraping against the floor, and everything in the room seemed to hold its breath. The bed, the dresser, the small chair by the window, they were all untouched, just like she had seen them weeks ago. But now, it felt like the room had been waiting for something to happen. For someone to come back. Her eyes fell on the portrait of the widow, hanging crooked above the bed. The woman's eyes were cold, sharp. Ruth could almost feel the weight of them on her skin. She had cleaned the room countless times before, but never like this. Never with the air so heavy, so thick with things unsaid. The walls seemed to press in around her, the silence louder than ever. Ruth's gaze drifted across the room, lingering on the small wooden box tucked beneath the bed. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't seen it before. The shadows in the room seemed to move, as if they were watching her, urging her to go closer. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, and soon, Ruth was kneeling on the floor, reaching for the box. It was old, the wood cracked and worn, and it felt cold to the touch. She pulled it from its hiding place, setting it on the floor beside her. Something inside rattled softly. Ruth swallowed, her breath shaky, and slowly opened the box. The smell of age and dust hit her first. Inside, there were papers, old, brittle letters, yellowing with age. She could barely make out the writing, but one letter caught her eye. She picked it up, unfolding the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was tight, hurried, desperate. She read the words. "Please. Help me. It's too late. There's no time." Ruth's stomach twisted. She glanced down at the name written at the bottom of the letter. Emery. Her breath caught in her throat. Emery. The name of the father who had disappeared without a trace. The man who had abandoned her, who had left the family behind. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the paper, as if the words on the page might disappear if she blinked. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Her hands trembled as she let the letter fall from her fingers, her pulse quickening. She looked around the room, at the walls that seemed to close in on her. The cabin groaned, like it was alive, and Ruth's mind raced with the thought of what this meant. What it all meant. She stood quickly, the room spinning around her. The widow had known her father. Had written to him. What had he done? What had happened here? The whispers in her mind grew louder, but they weren't her own thoughts. They were something else. Help me. Ruth spun around, but the room was still. Silent. The door creaked behind her. The air was colder now, biting at her skin. The whispers were sharper now, growing louder, growing desperate. She could feel them on the edges of her skin, like a breath at the back of her neck. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. Ruth's eyes flicked to the window, to the shadows in the corners of the room. She didn't know if she could stand it any longer, the weight of the house pressing in on her chest. She had to leave. She had to get out. But when she moved toward the door, she heard it again. A soft whisper, so close she could feel it in her ear. Help me. The room was suffocating, the air thick with the echo of those words. Ruth's heart raced. She ran to the door, her hand flying to the knob. The whisper followed her, the cold brushing against her skin as she wrenched the door open and ran down the stairs, her feet stumbling over the wooden steps. She couldn't escape it. The house. The whispers. The past. And as she burst through the door and into the night, she realized it wasn't over. Not yet. Ruth walked away from the widow's cabin, the night air cold against her skin. Her heart was still racing, the weight of the letter, the whispers, pressing down on her chest. The past had clawed its way back into her life in a way she hadn't expected. She thought she could bury it, leave it all behind, but the house, the widow, and now this, her father's name, scrawled in desperate handwriting, had pulled her back into a web she couldn't escape. Her hands were shaking as she held the letter. She glanced down at the words, her father's name, Emery, a reminder of everything she had tried to forget. It was all there, tangled up in the letter, in the widow's pleas. The past was far from over, it was alive, breathing right beside her, forcing her to confront the truth. She needed answers. But where could she find them? Ruth shoved the letter into her coat pocket, quickening her pace down the dirt road leading out of the cabin's clearing. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves along the ground. The town wasn't far, but it felt like an eternity away tonight. Every step felt heavy, like the ground was dragging her back. The world felt unnaturally quiet, the night stretching out before her as though it were waiting for her to make her move. As she neared the edge of town, Ruth noticed the familiar silhouette of the old general store in the distance. Her breath hitched. The store was quiet at this hour, the windows dark, the sign hanging crooked above the door. It hadn't changed in years. Nothing had changed in this town. The streets were empty as usual, the houses silent in the night. Ruth kept her head down as she passed the familiar faces, people who knew her but never saw her. The town hadn't forgotten her. She could feel the eyes on her as she walked, but no one spoke, no one stopped to ask where she had been. They knew. They always knew. The townsfolk carried their judgment in silence, hidden behind half-turned heads in quiet whispers. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just watching her, they were watching for her. Her father's house was on the outskirts of town, a place she hadn't been in years. The memory of it was like an old scar, painful, but distant. It was hard to imagine anything there now. The house had been abandoned long ago, left to rot as the town's memory of Emery faded. When Ruth finally stood before the house, she could barely recognize it. The windows were boarded up, the front porch sagging, overgrown vines creeping up the side of the house. It looked like a place that had given up, like it was waiting for someone to come and end its misery. Ruth stared at the house, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. She hadn't planned to come here, but now that she was standing in front of it, she couldn't seem to move. This was where it all started. Ruth didn't knock. There was no one here, after all. She just stepped up onto the creaky porch, her boots heavy on the wood. The door was slightly ajar, and without thinking, she pushed it open. The house smelled like dust and mildew, the air stale and thick with memories. Ruth stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dim interior. The walls were cracked, the furniture covered in sheets, but it was the same house. The same place where everything had fallen apart. She moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The silence in here felt different, like the house was holding its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. Or maybe someone. Ruth moved through the rooms, each one darker than the last. She didn't know why she was here. She wasn't looking for answers, was she? She had to find Emery, but this place, this house, had no answers for her. Only questions. The kitchen was just as she remembered, the old stove in the corner, the sink that had been unused for years. The chair at the table was still there, dust settled across its surface. Ruth ran her fingers across the edge of the table, the smoothness of the wood a sharp contrast to the heaviness in the air. And then she saw it, an envelope. Sitting alone on the counter, unopened. It was yellowed with age, the seal broken long ago. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now, it was all she could focus on. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Emery's. Her father's handwriting. With trembling hands, Ruth reached for the envelope. She pulled it open, the paper inside worn and fragile. She unfolded it carefully, the words inside faded with time, but still legible. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this for you. But it's too late now. You'll have to find your own way, just like I did." Ruth felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The letter didn't explain anything. It didn't tell her why he had left. It didn't tell her why he hadn't come back. But it told her enough. He had known. He had known everything. And he had left her to carry it. The room around her seemed to spin. Ruth's vision blurred. The past, her father's choices, the widow's letter, it all came crashing down on her at once. She couldn't breathe. She felt the walls closing in around her. The anger rose up, sharp and bitter. She had been abandoned. She had been left to pick up the pieces of a life she never chose, to face the wreckage of a family that had broken long before she was old enough to understand. Ruth crumpled the letter in her hands, her chest tight with the force of her breath. She couldn't do this. Not anymore. She couldn't keep carrying the weight of everyone's mistakes, couldn't keep living in the shadow of a man who had never looked back. The house felt suffocating now. The walls, the air, the silence, it was all too much. She turned on her heel, pushing through the kitchen door, heading back toward the front. She didn't look back. But as she stepped outside, the wind bit at her skin, the weight of the night still hanging on her. She knew what she had to do now. She had to find Emery. She had to find the answers. The town was hiding them from her, but she was done running. She was going to confront him. She was going to make him answer for what he had done. No more silence. Ruth walked through the quiet streets of the town, the weight of the letter still pressed against her chest, the urgency of her steps growing with every passing second. It had been years since she had walked these streets, but it felt as if nothing had changed. The same dusty roads, the same worn-out houses, the same faces that didn't look at her but still knew exactly who she was. She passed by the town's general store, the windows dark and lifeless. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, but no one was around. No one to stop her, no one to speak to her. The silence was suffocating. Ruth didn't look at the buildings, didn't meet the eyes of anyone she passed. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The town had always known her, but never really seen her. They didn't need to. The houses here had a way of blending into each other, all the same worn wood and faded paint, each one a reflection of the next. Nothing about this place stood out, except for the way it felt like a dead weight pressing on your chest. This town was like a well, deep and silent, and Ruth had been dropped in without ever knowing how deep it went. She couldn't stop herself now, though. She was heading for Emery's house. She had no plan, no idea what she would find when she arrived, but she knew she couldn't put it off any longer. The questions were eating her up from the inside out, and the only way to silence them was to confront the source. The man who had abandoned her. The man who had written that letter. The house wasn't far from the center of town, sitting at the edge like it had always been waiting for her return. Ruth had stopped coming here years ago, the day her father had walked out, leaving nothing behind but a memory that had never fully faded. She never expected to come back. Never thought she'd need to. But now, she was here. And the house, with its crooked roof and sagging porch, stared back at her like a skeleton waiting to be unearthed. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown, a small patch of wild grass stubbornly pushing through the dirt. The fence that used to be neat and tidy now leaned at odd angles, giving the house an abandoned, forgotten feel. Ruth stood at the edge of the yard, looking at it, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected it to look like this, worse than she remembered. The house felt like it had been abandoned long before Emery had left, as though it had given up on everything. But still, she couldn't turn away. She couldn't let it go. Ruth stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dry earth. She didn't hesitate as she climbed the creaky steps, ignoring the voice in her head that told her to turn around, to leave this place and never return. She knew she had to do this. She had to know the truth. She reached for the door, but it wasn't locked. It swung open easily, the hinges groaning in protest, and Ruth stepped inside. The house smelled like dust, like forgotten things. The air inside was stale, the kind of stillness that only comes from years of neglect. The floors creaked under her weight, the boards uneven and worn down by time. The furniture was covered in sheets, ghosts of a lifelong past, and the silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Ruth wandered through the house, each room colder than the last. The walls were peeling, the paint chipped, the windows covered in grime. She walked past the kitchen, the small table where her father had once sat, silent as ever. But the house didn't seem to remember the past the way Ruth did. It was just a house empty, hollow, a shell of something that had once been alive. She moved toward the stairs, her feet dragging as if the house itself was trying to keep her from going up. She climbed them slowly, the steps creaking under her weight. The hallway at the top was dark, the door to the old bedroom barely visible through the shadows. Ruth's hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before she pushed it open. The room was just as she remembered it, dim, forgotten, the old bed pushed against the wall, the dresser covered in dust. It was strange to see it like this again, so still, so lifeless. The house had always felt alive to Ruth, full of memories, of conversations, of things unsaid. Now, it felt like a tomb. A place that held nothing but ghosts. Her eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where a small wooden chest sat. Ruth didn't remember it being there before, but it was there now, a small reminder of things she had left behind. She moved toward it, her fingers brushing the rough wood. The chest was locked, but it didn't matter. Ruth wasn't interested in what was inside. What she needed was the truth, and it wasn't in a box. But as she stood there, staring at the chest, a cold breeze swept through the room. Ruth shivered, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel it then, the presence in the room. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't silent. It was filled with something heavy, something watching. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the stillness. But the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ruth backed out of the room, her heart racing. She didn't know what she expected to find here, some kind of answer, maybe. But the truth wasn't in this house. The house had no answers, no explanations. It was just a shell of what had been. She turned and left, walking out of the house, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the house. It wasn't the house that had failed her. It was the man inside it. Amory had failed her. He had failed her the moment he walked out, leaving her to deal with the mess he left behind. The wind picked up, blowing through the dead grass. The town was silent, as always, but Ruth felt something shift inside her. She wasn't here for the house. She wasn't here for the ghosts. She was here for answers. She was here to find Amory, to confront him. And she was going to make him face the past. Ruth walked through the overgrown yard, her boots dragging through the dead grass. She had passed this well countless times as a child, but now, standing before it, it felt different. It was broken, its stone rim cracked, the rope that used to wind around the pulley snapped, and the well itself had filled with dry, dead leaves. The once pristine stone that had been so meticulously cared for was now neglected, falling apart under the weight of time. The well was a place of memories, like everything else in this town. A place where the past clung to the present like a stubborn vine, winding its way into every crevice. Ruth's heart ached as she looked at the well. It had once been a place of connection, a place where her father would stand, pulling up water from deep within the earth. It had been a task he performed every day without fail, as though it was the one thing that anchored him to this place, this family. But now, it was abandoned. The rope had been snapped, the stone rim crumbled. It felt as though the well had given up long before Amory had. Ruth stood at its edge, staring into the dark, empty hole below. The emptiness felt suffocating. She didn't know what she was expecting, but there was nothing here. Just dirt, just decay. It was a mirror of her own life. She bent down, her fingers brushing the cracked stones. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and the faintest hint of something familiar. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened here, the fights, the silence, the leaving. This was where it all began. This was where her father had started to disappear. Where the cracks in the foundation of their family first appeared. She had watched him as a child, seen him lower the rope into the well, pull up the water, and carry it inside. It had always seemed like such a simple task, so necessary. But now, the well was dry. There was no water, no life. Only emptiness. The memories flooded back, her father's gruff voice calling out to her as he worked, his hands rough from years of labor. And then the silence. The long silences that had filled the house after he had left, after he had abandoned them. Ruth's fingers curled into the dirt, the sharp sting of the past creeping into her bones. She could feel it, the weight of what had been left unsaid. Amory had worked that well every day. He had always been there. But then one day, he wasn't. Ruth looked up, her gaze drifting to the house behind her, and she felt a deep, gnawing emptiness. The world around her was still, but she wasn't. She couldn't move forward, couldn't bury the past, not while it still had its claws in her. The town had never forgotten her, never forgotten her father. They hadn't let her forget either. Ruth stood for a long time, her fingers still pressed against the stone, before she finally pulled her hand away. The emptiness in the well seemed to reflect the emptiness inside her. She had to face it. She had to face him. Amory wasn't just a man who had walked away. He was part of this place, part of this town, part of her. And if she was ever going to move on, if she was ever going to be free of the shadow he had left behind, she had to confront him. She had to make him see the damage he had done, the wounds he had left. The wind picked up again, whistling through the trees, the sound of it like a distant cry. Ruth's eyes narrowed as she turned away from the well, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to leave this town without answers. Without confronting the man who had built this house, this well, and had broken it all. She didn't know if she would ever understand why Emery had left, but she knew one thing: the well was broken, and it couldn't be fixed by running away anymore. She couldn't keep running from the past. With one last glance at the decaying well, Ruth made her way back toward the house. She had a decision to make. The questions that had been eating away at her, the years of unanswered pain, they had to end now. She didn't know what she would find when she confronted Emery, but she had to try. For herself. For the past. For the future. Ruth couldn't stop thinking about the well. The way it had once been a place of life, of purpose, and now lay broken, forgotten, like everything else in her past. But the well was more than just a physical structure to her. It was a marker. A symbol. A place where things had started to fall apart, where the cracks in her family's foundation first began to show. She walked through the town in a daze, the weight of her thoughts dragging her down with each step. The letter she had found in the widow's cabin, the one with her father's name on it, felt like it had burned through her fingers. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The words, the desperation. The plea for help. What did it all mean? Why had the widow written to him? What was it he had done? What had he become? Ruth's feet carried her to the old town library, a place she hadn't stepped foot in since she was a girl. The doors were heavy, the wood creaking as she pushed them open. The inside of the library smelled of old paper and dust, the shelves lined with books that had been untouched for years. But Ruth wasn't looking for books. She was looking for something else. Something to tie the pieces of the past together. She approached the front desk, where an older woman sat behind a pile of books, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. Ruth cleared her throat. "Can I help you, dear?" the librarian asked, her voice thick with years of disuse. "I need to see the records," Ruth said, her voice steady, though a knot tightened in her stomach. The records of the town, the old, dusty files that no one had bothered to look at in decades. The kind of records that held the secrets of the past. The librarian raised an eyebrow. "Records? What kind of records?" "Any records about Emery," Ruth said, swallowing hard. "My father. I need to know what happened to him." The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and rose from her chair, moving toward a back room that smelled of mildew and old wood. Ruth followed her, her heart pounding. The librarian returned with a thick folder, its edges frayed, the paper yellowed with age. She set it down on the desk in front of Ruth, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of what lay inside. Ruth didn't waste any time. She opened it. Inside, there were pages of old town documents, marriage records, birth certificates, and then, there it was. A letter. A letter addressed to the mayor, dated years ago, just before Emery had disappeared. Ruth's fingers trembled as she pulled the letter out, the paper brittle, the ink faded. She began to read. "To whom it may concern, I have received numerous complaints about the behavior of Emery, last name, and it has become clear that his actions are no longer a matter of private concern. His abandonment of his family, his unwillingness to meet his obligations, is a matter of record. I have included further evidence in the attached documents, but I warn you, this is not an easy matter to face. The people of this town will not turn a blind eye much longer." The letter was signed by the sheriff, his name barely legible at the bottom. Ruth's throat closed up as she read the words again. Abandonment. His actions were no longer a private concern. Had the town known what he had done? Had they been watching him all this time? Her mind raced. Emery hadn't just left. He had done something that had turned the town against him. Something that had made his actions public. Ruth couldn't understand it. She couldn't understand how the man who had been her father could become someone the town had to warn others about. What had happened to him? She closed the folder, her hands shaking, and stood up abruptly, turning to the librarian. The woman was watching her with a quiet sympathy, but Ruth didn't want to look at her anymore. She didn't want to hear the pity in anyone's voice. Is there more? Ruth asked, her voice tight. The librarian shook her head. That's all I have. Ruth swallowed hard, her chest tightening with something like rage and grief all at once. She had come here for answers. But now, she had more questions. What had her father done? Why had he left? Why had he abandoned her and his whole life here, without a trace? She turned and left the library without another word, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the quiet streets. The sun was setting, painting the sky with muted hues of orange and purple, but Ruth barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts tangled in the mess her father had left behind. She didn't know where to go next. She didn't know where the answers were. But she couldn't stay in this town anymore. She couldn't keep walking past the places that reminded her of him, of the family he had destroyed, of the town that had never let her forget. Ruth made her way to the old house again, her feet moving of their own accord, the anger bubbling up inside her. She was so close to the answers, and yet they were just out of reach. What had he done to deserve this? What had driven him to abandon everything? To leave his own daughter to fend for herself? She stood in front of the house, staring at the boarded-up windows, the cracked porch. It looked so different now. So abandoned. Just like her. Just like him. But this time, Ruth wasn't walking away. She wasn't going to leave until she had the truth. She had been silent for too long. Now, she was going to make Emery answer for what he had done. She had to. For herself. For the town. For the years he had taken from her. Ruth sat in the dark of her car, parked just outside the gates of Emery's old property. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches of the trees and stirring the dry grass that clung to the yard. She hadn't moved for hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The letter, the one the widow had written to Emery, still burned in her pocket. Each word felt like a flame on her skin. The desperation in the widow's handwriting kept playing over and over in her mind. But it wasn't the widow she needed to confront now. It was Emery. She had driven to the house on impulse, her heart pushing her forward even though her mind screamed at her to turn around. She hadn't even known why she was here at first. What was she expecting? To find answers? To find some kind of redemption for the broken pieces of her life? But now, after reading that letter from the sheriff, everything had changed. Her father hadn't just disappeared. He had left with purpose. His departure hadn't been just about leaving her behind. No, it was about leaving everything behind, his family, his responsibilities, his obligations. He had abandoned the town, too. The anger that had simmered inside her for years was boiling over. The man she had once looked up to, the man she had believed was a constant presence, was nothing but a coward who ran when things got tough. She opened the car door and stepped into the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. She hadn't felt anything real for so long. Not since he left. The house stood before her, imposing and silent. The windows were boarded up, the front door closed with a padlock. There was no life here anymore, no sign of anyone living inside. It looked like a house that had been abandoned long before her father had left. But the truth was, she had always felt abandoned by him, even when he had been there. She moved toward the house slowly, her boots crunching against the dry ground. She hadn't come this far to turn back. Ruth stood on the porch and reached for the door, her fingers lingering on the cold metal of the lock. Her father had kept this house locked up, just like he had kept everything locked away inside himself. Ruth didn't have the key, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. With one sharp movement, she kicked the door open. It swung inward with a creak, the dark interior beyond a hollow reminder of all that had been lost. The air inside smelled stale, but there was something else too, something deeper, a smell of rot, of things left to die. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. Everything that had been hidden for so long. Ruth stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her. The room was just as she remembered, but it felt wrong. Everything was wrong. She walked through the house, feeling the weight of the years, the silence settling around her like a thick blanket. She passed by the kitchen, the table still sitting empty, just like when she had left. The chairs were all turned toward each other, but there was no one to sit in them. She could almost hear her father's voice, harsh and distant, echoing through the empty space. But that was a lie. Her father hadn't been there when it mattered. He had left her alone, just like everyone else who had ever walked away. Ruth kept moving. She reached the stairs and climbed them slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to stop her from moving forward. But she couldn't stop. She had to know. At the top of the stairs, she turned toward the hallway, the door to Emery's old bedroom at the end. The door was still cracked open, just as it had been when she was a child. It was the place where he used to disappear to, hiding away from the rest of the world. It was the place where Ruth had always felt most alone. She pushed the door open without hesitation. The room was untouched, except for the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. The bed was still there, the dresser still standing in the corner, the drawers pulled open but empty. She walked over to the desk where her father had once sat and pulled open the drawer. It was empty, just like the rest of the room. Empty, just like the promises he had made to her. But then, beneath the dust, she saw it. A letter. Another one. This one wasn't addressed to the widow, and it wasn't addressed to the town. It was addressed to Ruth. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked it up, the paper crinkling under her fingers as she unfolded it. Ruth, I know I can't fix what I've done. I know I've let you down. But I never wanted to leave you. I thought if I stayed, I would only hurt you more. I thought you were better off without me. I thought the world would be easier if I just left. But I was wrong. I should have stayed. I should have been the father you needed. If there's anything I can do to make this right, I will, but I understand if you don't want to hear from me again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. The letter was signed with just one word, Emery. Ruth let the letter fall from her fingers, her heart pounding. Her father's words felt hollow. They felt like nothing more than excuses, apologies that came too late. He had left, and no amount of sorries could change that. The damage had been done, and Ruth had carried the burden of it for years. The weight of the letter settled heavily in her chest. The anger that had been simmering inside her began to burn hotter. He had made his choice. He had walked away from her, from everything, and now he thought a letter could fix it? Ruth slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the house, and stepped back into the hallway. She felt the storm inside her rising, threatening to burst. She had come for answers. But all she had found were excuses. And now, Ruth realized something. She didn't need Emery to fix anything. She didn't need him to make it right. She was done waiting for him to choose her. She was done being a part of the past. It was time for her to choose herself. Ruth didn't know what she was expecting when she knocked on Emery's door. Maybe she thought she'd find him older, more broken. Maybe she thought he would be a man who would learn from his mistakes. But the man who opened the door was the same one she had always known as silent, distant, a shadow of the man who had walked out on her so many years ago. He stood in the doorway, his face lined with age, his eyes shadowed by years of regret and silence. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, his gaze searching, like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. Ruth, he finally said, his voice gruff, as though he hadn't spoken in years. I didn't think I'd see you again. Ruth stood there, her heart pounding, her fists clenched at her sides. She had waited for this moment for so long. The years of silence, the years of anger, of abandonment, they had led her to this. And now, as she stood face to face with the man who had left her behind, the words wouldn't come. The years of pent-up rage and grief felt like a wall, and she couldn't push through it. Not yet. You didn't think I'd come back? Ruth asked, her voice colder than she meant it to be. I didn't think you'd care. You didn't care, did you? You left. And then you disappeared. And you thought that was it. Emery's gaze faltered for a moment, and he stepped back, pulling the door open wider, a silent invitation for her to come inside. But Ruth didn't need his permission. She stepped past him, moving into the dimly lit house. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, just like she remembered. Everything had been left to rot, as if the house itself was abandoned just as much as she had been. "I never wanted to leave you," Emery said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "But there were things I couldn't fix. Things I couldn't change." Ruth turned to face him, her eyes sharp with accusation. "Things you couldn't fix," she repeated, her words cutting through the air. "You left me, Emery. You left me with nothing but an empty house and a broken family. And you're standing here, telling me you couldn't fix it?" Emery's face hardened, the guilt in his eyes replaced by a thin veneer of defensiveness. "I thought you'd be better off without me," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought if I stayed, I'd only make things worse." "Worse?" Ruth's voice cracked, the weight of her anger rising, threatening to spill over. "You think leaving made it better? You think walking away from your own daughter made things better?" Emery's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked like the man she used to know, the man who had once tried to protect her, in his own broken way. The man who had taught her how to survive. But then that expression disappeared, and all that was left was a stranger standing in front of her. "I couldn't stay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't strong enough." Ruth didn't know if she wanted to hit him or hug him. The years of bitterness and resentment had built up so high, they felt like an impenetrable wall between them. She wanted answers, but she didn't know if any answer could ever make it okay. She wanted him to explain why he had left, but did she really want to know? Did it even matter anymore? "You think I needed you?" Ruth said, her voice breaking through the tension like a crack of thunder. "You think I needed you to make my life better? I was just a kid, Emery. I was just a kid, and you—" She stopped herself, her throat tight, unable to speak the words. "You weren't there." Emery stepped forward, his hands outstretched, but Ruth took a step back, shaking her head. She didn't want his touch. She didn't want his apology. Not anymore. "You're right," he said quietly, the weight of his admission hanging between them. "I wasn't there. And I can't take back what I did. I can't change the past, Ruth. But I've lived with it every day. I've thought about you, about what I left behind. And it eats at me." The silence stretched out between them, and Ruth fought back the tears that threatened to rise. This man, this stranger who had once been her father, couldn't give her the answers she wanted. He couldn't undo the years of hurt, of abandonment, of neglect. No words could fix that. "You should have stayed," Ruth said, her voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of everything she had carried alone. "You should have stayed and faced it. You should have stayed and been my father. But you didn't. And now, I'm standing here, and I don't even know who you are anymore." Emery's face crumpled, the emotion breaking through his hardened exterior. He reached for her again, but this time, Ruth didn't pull away. She didn't step back. She stood still, watching him as he approached. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy in his mouth. "I wish I could have been there for you. I wish I had been the man you needed me to be." Ruth's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "It's too late for that," she said quietly. For the first time, she truly understood what her father's absence had cost her. She had spent so many years fighting the silence, fighting the absence of the man who should have been there. But now, standing in front of him, she realized that the fight wasn't hers to carry anymore. The silence between them grew, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same silence that had haunted her all these years. This time, it was a different kind of quiet, a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Ruth turned and walked out the door, leaving Emery standing in the room behind her. The night air was cold, but it felt different now. Lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but she finally knew she could walk away from this place. She could walk away from the past. And she wouldn't look back. Ruth stood at the edge of the widow's cabin, staring at the door, her heart a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She had left Emery behind, a chapter closed in a way that felt unfinished. But now, standing here, she knew that the cabin still held more than just memories. It was more than just the place where the widow had lived. It was a symbol, a relic of everything Ruth had lost, of everything that had been taken from her without warning. She had faced her father. She had spoken the truth she had been holding in for years. But there was still one last thing she needed to do. One last thing to face. Ruth stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dry ground. The cabin felt like a presence now, more than a building. The wood was weathered, the shutters hanging loosely on the hinges. The door was slightly ajar, as though it, too, was waiting for her return. The place had never truly been abandoned. Even now, Ruth could feel the widow's eyes on her, as if the woman was watching from the shadows. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and stale air filling her lungs. The house looked the same as it had the first time she came here to clean. The furniture was covered with sheets, the kitchen untouched, the fireplace cold. The silence was louder than ever, pressing in on her, wrapping around her like a shroud. Ruth moved toward the back of the cabin, her eyes scanning the room, but it wasn't the room she was after. She knew what she needed to do. She had to find the truth that had been buried here, hidden by time, silence, and secrets. The attic door was just ahead, the wooden steps leading up into the dark. She hesitated for a moment, then ascended. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the cabin. When she reached the top, she could barely make out the outlines of the old boxes and relics strewn about. She had been in this attic many times before, but today it felt different. Today, it felt like something was waiting. Her eyes fell on an old chest, tucked in the corner, covered with dust. Ruth didn't hesitate this time. She pulled the chest open, the rusted hinges protesting with a groan. Inside, she found more than just forgotten belongings. There were letters, some of them old, some barely legible, and at the bottom, a photograph, folded and yellowed with age. She lifted it carefully, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. It was a picture of the widow, her stern face staring back at Ruth. But there was something else in the picture, something that made Ruth's stomach twist. Standing next to the widow was a man. The man looked familiar, though Ruth couldn't place him. He was older than she remembered, but his eyes, the same eyes as Emery's. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The widow and Emery, had they known each other before? Had this woman, the one who had written to Emery, been more than just a figure from his past? Ruth's hands shook as she stared at the photo. The widow's face was stern, yes, but the way she stood next to the man, there was something there. A connection, a history that Ruth had never known. Ruth sank to her knees, the weight of the revelation crashing over her. She had come here looking for answers about Emery, but what she had found was something else entirely. The widow and her father had shared a past. A history that Ruth had been shut out of. She had thought she was the only one left in the wake of Emery's abandonment. But she wasn't. The widow had been here, a witness to it all, and now Ruth realized the depth of that connection. She pulled another letter from the chest, the edges brittle, the ink faded. It was written in the same hurried handwriting as the letter to Emery. She read it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as the words sank in.